I'd stopped by Clara's place to drop off the sweater she'd left at my apartment last weekend. The front door was unlocked, like it always was, and I called out her name as I stepped inside, kicking off my sneakers beside the entryway bench stacked with library books and Hayden's soccer cleats. She'd run out to grab soda from the gas station down the street. She'd texted 5 minutes before I arrived, asking if I could hang around until she got back. Her laptop sat open on the kitchen island, screen glowing bright against the quiet room. The Messenger app still pulled up on her desktop. I moved toward it, ready to lock the screen and log her out so no one else could snoop while she was gone, when a small notification ping popped in the corner. A group chat message. To celebrate Hayden's improved grades, we're having a family dinner tonight. Curiosity tugged hard at me before I could talk myself away. I hesitated for only a second, then clicked the preview to open the thread. There were 4 names listed at the top of the chat window: Aunt Margaret, Uncle Troy, Clara, and Hayden. That was it. No me. No one else from the wider family we gathered with every holiday. A private thread, just the 4 of them, and I had never known it existed. My throat tightened a little as I scrolled up through older messages, skimming lines I wasn't supposed to read. Most were casual plans, grocery lists for weekend barbecue, reminders about Hayden's upcoming driver's test. Nothing alarming at first glance. I told myself I should close it immediately, that invading Clara's privacy was wrong, that I was only making trouble for myself by looking further. My finger hovered over the exit button, but another line caught my eye halfway up the page, typed by Aunt Margaret that morning, only an hour before I'd showed up at the house. We'll bring it up gently over dinner. She won't want to cause a scene in front of everyone. A low buzz hummed in my ear. Bring what up? Who was she talking about? There was no context in that single sentence, no follow-up, just that quiet, calculated line. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting, scrolling faster to see if there was more context hidden further up the chat history. Before I could find anything else, I heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. Clara was back. Panic flared hot in my chest. I slammed the browser tab shut in one quick motion, reached out and closed the laptop lid away, the soft click echoing in the empty. I stepped back from Lind, crossing my arms like I'd never moved near the device, trying to steady my breathing so she wouldn't pick up on how flustered. The front door pushed open a moment later, Clara carrying 2 cold soda bottles in one hand and a crumpled bag of candy in the other. She smiled when she spotted me. Easy warm. The same familiar cousin smile we'd shared since we were kids running around Aunt Margaret's backyard chasing fireflies. Sorry it took a minute, she said, setting the drinks down on the counter next to the clothes. The line was longer than I did. Long? Really, I answered, forcing my tone to sound relaxed, casual, like I hadn't just stumbled into a secret group chat that clearly held plans kept. I nodded toward the sweater folded over my arm and set it down beside. Brought your knit sweater back, I said. I will. Thanks, Lila. I totally thought I left it, replied, glancing briefly at her laptop, not touching it. Hey, you got the text about night, right? At my parents' house around 6. We're celebrating Hayden's math test score. He pulled his grade up from a D to an E. Slowly, my mind still stuck on that line I read on the screen. We'll bring it up gently over dinner. She won't want to cause a scene in front of everyone. Yeah. I saw the message you sent to our regular family group earlier this afternoon, I said carefully, watching her face for any flicker of recognition or guilt. Her expression stayed neutral, no shift, hesitation. Perfect. Mom's making pot roast, the one you used to when we were younger, Clara went on, turning to grab a glass from the cabinet. What are you becoming? Everyone's excited, everyone. The words in my stomach. Everyone except me, apparently, when they talked about whatever business they planned to drag out at dinner table tonight. I smiled and agreed there at 6. Made up a quick excuse about needing to head home and finish inventory sheets for the book before I left, then said goodbye a few minutes later. The drive back to my small rental townhouse than usual. I kept replaying that short message over in my head, trying to guess what they intended to discuss, what they thought I would fight against if it kissed. I pulled into my drive and cut the car engine, sitting quiet for a minute. I'd always tried to keep the peace with Aunt Martha the family. I avoided arguments, said yes to favors was stretched thin, hated the thought of being labeled difficult or selfish by people I'd grown up beside. But that chat changed something. If they were hiding a private thread, carefully timing the conversation for a family dinner, where I would not to argue, then whatever they wanted from me wasn't so easily. I grabbed my bag and stepped inside my house, behind me. I set my keys on the entry table and pulled my phone out of my pocket, blank screen. Part of me wanted to text Clara and ask outright what they planned to talk about tonight. The The smarter part warned me to stay quiet, to wait, to watch and listen first. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked at the quiet neighborhood street, the late afternoon sun, the oak trees. Tonight's dinner wasn't just a station for Hayden's grade. It was a setup, and I'd walked straight into knowing about it before anyone expected me to catch on. The question hanging over now was simple and sharp. What exactly were they asking me to give up? The next morning started early at the bookstore. I unlocked the front doors, flipped the overhead lights on, and arranged the new release display by the register, but my focus drifted constantly to the text Clara had sent the night before. Her quiet warning looped in my head, and I kept replaying whether I'd been too sharp in my reply. By mid-morning, the shop slowed down, and I pulled my phone out, drafting a careful message to lock in the meeting Aunt Margaret wanted. I picked a neutral public spot, the downtown diner where we'd eaten brunch a handful of times, instead of agreeing to meet at their house. Being on their turf felt like handing them another advantage. Clara wrote back quickly, confirming Wednesday afternoon at 2. She added a line saying she was glad I was willing to listen, and that she hoped we could keep things civil. Against Maya's earlier advice, I let my guard slip a little. I typed out a longer message, explaining how much the land meant to me, how Grandma had talked about letting me build a small home there once I was ready, how hurt I was that they'd planned this whole pitch behind my back. I hit send before I could overthink it, hoping Clara might understand where I stood and help ease the tension between everyone. I went back to shelving book, feeling lighter for getting my feelings off my chest. I imagined Clara reading it, realizing how unfair the whole setup had been, and talking her parents into dropping the request entirely. That fragile optimism lasted until my lunch break, when Maya called to check in. I told her I'd opened up to Clara in a long text, and she sighed immediately. Lila, you can't assume she's on your side, Maya said. She grew up under Margaret's roof. She spent decades learning to go along to keep the peace. Anything you tell her can get passed straight to the rest of that group. My stomach dropped. I pulled up our conversation thread and stared at the paragraphs I'd sent only an hour earlier. It was too late to delete them, though. The message had gone through, and Clara had already. I told myself Maya was being simple, that Clara wouldn't share private thoughts meant just. Still, unease settled heavy in my. By Tuesday evening, small things started shifting among our extended. A distant cousin texted me out of the blue, asking why I was refusing to help Hayden get a start. An aunt from my dad's side left a vague comment on my social media post about being generous to family. No one outright accused me, but the whispers were there, quieted. Word was spreading, and the story being told was mine. They painted me as selfish, clinging to unused land while a teenage family member needed it for. I called Maya again that night, frustrated. How did everyone hear about this so fast? I haven't talked to anyone besides you. Maya did hesitate. Your message to Clara aired. That's the only explanation. She sent it to the private group, and Margaret started looping in other relatives to. I didn't want to leave it, but the pieces lined up perfectly. I pulled up my chat with Clara and sent a short, direct question asking if she'd forwarded our. She read the message with 3 minutes, then didn't. No denial, no apology, nothing. The silence was answer enough. The trust I'd still held onto for her snapped. I'd opened up honestly, and she'd handed my words over to the people trying to. That same night, scrolling through local community posts to unwind, I stumbled on a small thread from Hayden's high school parent page. A teacher had commented that several students had their math final scores flagged for review after a grading error was corrected. One of the student names listed was Hayden Carter. I froze, reading the line twice. The whole dinner had been framed around her earned B, a milestone everyone celebrated. But what if that improved grade wasn't from extra studying? What if the score had been adjusted through a school mistake or an appeal? I closed the browser quick, mind racing. If Hayden's grade wasn't honestly earned, then the entire excuse for that family dinner had been on something shaky. The celebration was just a convenient cover for their real plan to pressure me at the deed. I sat back in my chair, processing everything that had happened over the past few days. I'd trusted Clara with my vulnerability, let me down. Now I had a new question over everything. Had they known Hayden's grade was not fully legitimate at dinner? My phone buzzed again. This time, a calendar reminder for the diner meeting with Aunt Margaret the next afternoon. The reminder aside, already shifting how I would show up. I wouldn't come hoping for understanding or peaceful compromise. I would come prepared, calm, and guarded, knowing nothing I said would stay private at myself. The rift between Clara and me was real now, and I could no longer count on her control party. I'd misjudged her loyalty, and that mistake had cost me. The only person I could rely on to protect my interests moving forward was myself. The rest of the afternoon dragged by in slow, heavy stretches. I went through the motions of finishing my bookstore inventory, scanning stacks of paperback novels and marking down damaged spines, but my focus kept slipping back to that closed laptop and the line Aunt Margaret had typed. Every time my phone buzzed on the counter, I flinched, half expecting a message that would lay the whole plan bare before dinner even started. Nothing came. Only a quick reminder from Clara at 4:30, asking if I still planned to arrive by 6. I typed back a short yes and set the phone face down, determined not to spiral further before I had to face them all. I pulled into the Carter driveway at 5:50, 10 minutes early. The garage door stood open, and I could hear Uncle Troy running a vacuum somewhere inside the house. The smell of slow-cooked pot roast drifted out onto the front porch, warm and familiar, the same scent I'd associated with safe family gatherings for most of my life. Today it felt like a mask. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my blouse, and climbed out of my car with a bottle of red wine I'd picked up on the way over. Clara answered the door almost immediately. She took the wine from my hands with a bright smile and led me into the dining room, where Aunt Margaret was setting out cloth napkins beside each plate. Hayden slouched in one of the wooden dining chairs, scrolling on his phone, barely glancing up when I walked in. "Lila, so glad you're here," Aunt Margaret said, turning to greet. Her voice was warm, but her eyes lingered on me a beat too long, like she was already gauging my mood. "Have a seat. Dinner will be on the table in about 10 minutes. Troy's just finishing up in the..." I sat down across from Hayden, forcing myself to make small talk. "Congrats on the math grade. I heard you pulled it up to a..." He shrugged without looking away from his... "Yeah, what? Mom's making a big deal out of..." Clara laughed lightly as she set the wine on the side. "Don't be modest. You worked hard for that." I watched her carefully, waiting for some tiny crack in her easy dinner, some hint that she knew I'd seen their private chat. There was nothing. She moved between the kitchen and dining room, carrying bowls of roasted vegetables and mashed potatoes, acting exactly like she had every other family night. For a second I wondered if I'd imagined if the message I'd read had been taken wildly out of context. That fragile hope faded fast when Uncle Troy walked in and sat beside me, and Aunt Margaret gave a quick, almost imperceptible. We passed plates around, filling our bowls with meat and veggie, and for the first 20 minutes the conversation's light. They talked about Hayden's soccer practice, Clara's busy work schedule at the town office, the leaky gutter on their roof that needed... No one mentioned anything that involved directly, and I began to wonder if maybe I'd overacted. Then Aunt Margaret set down her fork and wiped her mouth. And "There's something the four of us wanted to run tonight," gently, leaning forward at the table. "We didn't want to spring it on you out of nowhere, but this felt like the right moment." My fingers tightened around my... I kept ready. "Go ahead. You remember the small plot of land Grandma left you when she asked? The one on Oak Street just outside town." Well, Grandma had signed it over to me in her will prior. A narrow stretch with an old oak tree and enough space to build a tiny... It was the only thing of real value left behind, and it had felt like a gift just for me. "I remember," Aunt Margaret smiled, persuasive. "Hayden's going to graduate high school in a year and a half. We've been talking, and we think that lot would be perfect for him to build his first home once he finishes community college. Property values around keep climbing, and it would be so much easier if he didn't have to compete." The air felt... I sat very still, witnish. "We were hoping you'd consider sending it over to him," she continued. "You live in a townhouse already, and you don't have plans to build anything there soon, right? It would mean the world to our family. Grandma always wanted us together." I glanced at Clara, hoping to meet my eyes, hoping she'd say something fair. She stared at silent. Uncle Troy stayed beside his wife, and Hayden finally looked up from his phone, watching me with attention. All four of them were waiting for me to agree, just like they'd planned that private group chat. They'd timed this conversation perfectly for dinner, when turning them down would make me look ungrateful and cold in front. I took a slow sip of oak. That land was left specifically me in Grandma's will. I'm not comfortable right now. Aunt Margaret's pleasant expression faltered for only a second before she recovered. "I understand it like a big ask, honey. But think about what this would mean for Hayden. We could work something out as a concern. It's not about me," I told her. "It's about to leave me." The room went quiet. The clink of silverware stopped entirely. Hayden frowned and leaned back in his chair, my answer. Aunt Margaret's jaw tightened, and the warm, easy mood that had filled the room minutes before completely. Clara finally spoke up, and careful. "Maybe we can talk this another time, Mom. Not ruin dinner." Already done. The secret plan they'd hidden away in their private chat was out in the open, and every single one of them used to give in. I could feel the wrapping around the table, thick and unshakable. I'd planned to bring something up, but hearing the request out loud made the whole thing more real. They weren't asking for a favor. They were asking me to hand over my ends for Hayden's benefit, and they'd arranged this whole dinner. Aunt Margaret folded hands together on the table, arm on mine. We don't have to decide tonight. Hope you'll sleep on it, Lila. Family matters more than holding empty land you aren't using. I didn't reply. I stared at the pot roast on my plate, no longer hungry at all. I could feel 3 pairs of eyes watching, waiting for me to cave, waiting for eyes for saying no. The peaceful family dinner was over, and there was no going back to the easy relationship there before tonight. Whatever came next, I knew they wouldn't let the land go easily. I left the Carter house shortly after dessert, making up an excuse about early opening hours at the bookstore the next morning. No one argued when I stood from the table. The easy small talk had died completely, replaced by stiff, polite silence that clung to every corner of the dining room. Aunt Margaret only gave me a thin smile as I grabbed my jacket, repeating that I should take time to think over their request. Clara walked me to the front door, her voice low when she spoke, careful not to let her parents hear. I know this feels weird, she said, shifting her weight on the porch step. Mom can come on a little strong. Don't take it too personally. I paused with my hand on the car door handle, glancing back at her. It's hard not to take it personally when the whole thing was planned behind my back in a group chat I wasn't invited to. Clara's face paled. She opened her mouth like she might defend herself, then closed it again, staring down at the cracked concrete beneath her sneakers. I didn't have much of a choice. Mom made the chat years ago, just for our immediate household. It was never meant to be secret from you, not really. The excuse landed hollow. I didn't push the conversation further. Not with the front window behind her where Aunt Margaret might be watching. I just nodded and climbed into my car, pulling away from the house without another word. By the time I reached my townhouse, my hands still shook slightly on the steering wheel. Inside, I locked every door and flipped on the kitchen overhead light before pulling out my phone to call Mom. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm even through the speaker. I spilled the whole story quickly. The open laptop, the private chat, the dinner conversation, the demand for Grandma's land. She listened without interrupting until I finished, then sighed softly. First, you did the right thing saying no right away, Maya told me. That property is legally yours. They can't pressure you into signing it over just because they're family. But you need to get your paperwork together now. Find the will copy, anything official that proves ownership. I paced across my living room as we glancing toward the filing cabinet tucked in the corner of the spare bedroom. I'd stashed all Grandma's legal documents there after the sealed in a plain manila folder I hadn't touched in. I know where everything is. I just didn't expect them to push this hard, this fast. I always thought family wouldn't ask for something like that. Family doesn't automatically mean Maya said. Aunt Margaret has always faded. This isn't a size, even if the timing's rotten. You need to set clear boundaries and stop worrying about a... We stayed on the line another 2 minutes, walking through calm responses I could use if they called or texted to keep pressing the issue. One up, I pulled the manila folder out of the cabinet and spread the papers across my desk. The deed clear. No fingerprint, no shared ownership. Grandma had signed it directly to me, with a lawyer with... Relief settled in my chest, quiet and steady. The law was on my side. That didn't mean the fight. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a new text. I hesitated. I hate that things got made. Mom's really worried about Hayden's future. She keeps saying Grandma would want us to help each other out. Could you at least meet with her sometime this week to talk it through properly? No pressure, just conversation. I read the message twice. Part of me wanted to believe Clara was reaching to mediate, to soften the conflict between them. Another part remembered her silence across the table, the way she'd avoided meeting my eyes when Aunt Margaret made the demand. I typed a short reply, agreeing I would listen, but adding firmly that I would not make any promises about the land during. Minute I sent it, another message up from Clara. Be careful how you push back. Mom gets stubborn when... The warning sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't neutral advice. It was a quiet signal that the family pressure wasn't going to after one dinner. They planned to keep working on me, slowly wearing me down into my mind. I set my phone face down on the table and stared at the stack of leaves in front of me. For most of my life, I'd avoided confrontation with the side of my family. I'd skipped disagreements, apologized when I didn't need to, and bent to comfortable. That old pulled at me now, whispering that giving door peace, that the land wasn't worth family over. About Grandma, how she'd taken me out to that Oak Street teenager. pointing at the old oak tree and saying it would be my canvas someday. Unintentional. It wasn't spare property to hand off to Hayden just because I for him. I folded the documents carefully and locked the cabinet. I made a mental note to scan every page onto a secure cloud drive first thing tomorrow, creating digital backups in case anyone tried to copies. This was no longer a casual family quest I could brush off. It was a fight to protect something. I walked to the window and looked out at suburban street. Streetlights flickering on one by one, as dully tonight. I had being passive at dinner, but now I needed to stay consistent. If Aunt Margaret called to schedule that meeting, I would go prepared. I would not let guilt or obligation make me surrender what Grandma had left behind. The line I on that evening was permanent, and I had to be ready for what came next. I arrived at the downtown diner 10 minutes early on Wednesday afternoon. I picked a booth toward the back, away from the front windows and the counter chatter, and set my canvas bag beside me. Inside were printed copies of the property deed, Grandma's will, and a small notebook where I jotted down talking points. I had no intention of letting Aunt Margaret steer the conversation off track or wear me down with emotional appeals. When she walked through the door a few minutes later, she spotted me immediately and slid into the seat across without hesitation. She ordered black coffee from the server, folded her hands on the table, and opened with the same gentle, persuasive tone she'd used at dinner. She repeated how much the land would change Hayden's life, how property in Willow Creek kept rising in value, and how Grandma had always wanted the family to support one another. I listened quietly, letting her finish before I responded evenly. The deed is mine, legally and intentionally. I'm not willing to sign it over, I said. If Hayden needs help buying property someday, there are other options. But this specific lot is not negotiable. Aunt Margaret's pleasant expression hardened. She leaned forward, voice dropping low. You're being stubborn, Lila. This isn't how family behave. You'll regret pushing us all away over a patch of dirt you aren't used. We went back and forth for nearly 40 minutes. She tried offering a small cash payment, suggested a temporary lease, even floated the idea of splitting the land. Every alternative circled back to the same goal, giving Hayden control of the property. I declined each proposal calmly, sticking to my boundary without raising my voice. Eventually, she sat, and said she hoped I would reconsider before things got messy. Then she paid for her coffee and left without another good. I stayed in the booth for a while longer, sipping cold tea and replaying the conversation. The meeting had ended with no progress, just a quiet warning that conflict was. Once I got home, I pulled up the parent forum thread I'd seen the night before to dig deeper into Hayden's math grade. The original post had been edited to remove student names, but a cached snippet still showed Hayden's name attached to the grade view. I started searching for more information, careful not to post anything or message school staff directly to avoid crossing lines. That evening, I got a text from an old high school acquaintance who still worked in the district office. I kept my message neutral, asking general questions about how final grade corrections worked that. She replied an hour later, confirming that a handful of students had their math finals rescored after a rubric error from. Some students gained full letter grades overnight with zero extra work or studying. She didn't name names, but it lined up perfectly with what I'd seen earlier. Hayden's jump from a D to a B hadn't come from weeks of after-school tutoring or extra homework. It came from a grading mistake fixed. The realization settled heavy in my chest. The entire family dinner celebration had been built around They framed Hayden's improved score as proof of hard work to justify gathering everyone together and confronting me. I wondered how long Aunt Margaret and the rest of the private group had known about the rubric error before planning that dinner. Had they intentionally used the corrected grade as cover for their real agenda? Curiosity pushed me to revisit what I could remember of the chat I'd glimpsed on Clara's laptop. The message about celebrating Hayden's grades had sounded sincere on the surface, but now it read like a convenient excuse to assemble the family. I also pulled Grandma's will back out of the filing cabinet to read through slowly, and I caught a line I'd barely noticed before. If the property were ever transferred outside direct blood heirs, a portion of any sale proceeds would go to the local community food bank Grandma volunteered at for decades. It was a small clause, easy to overlook, but changed things. Aunt Margaret could not quietly push for a private transfer without triggering. I sat at the dining table, spreading the documents across the wood surface, and the 4-person private group had planned her ambush. They used Hayden's rescored grade as their excuse to gather. Clara had shared my private text messages to the group, sparking whispered gossip among ex. And Grandma's will held an extra condition they likely had fully considered: groan. If they learned I understood the full context behind Hayden's grade and the clause, they might rush to pressure me even harder before I could organize my evidence. I needed to preserve everything I had found, Form screenshots, cached text snippets, the exact word from Grandma's will, the email thread with buttons. I scanned every page and saved encrypted copies to 2 separates. Just as I finished the last upload, my phone vibrated an incoming call. The screen Margaret's name. My throat tightened. She had likely guessed I was digging into details, or someone had told her I was asking questions about the school grading changes. I hesitated before tapping accept. Lila, she said, voice steady and sharp. No warmth left this time. We need to meet again, just tomorrow morning. There are things we have properly yet. I gripped the edge of the table, weighing my options. Refusing might make her behind my back. Agreeing meant walking into another controlled conversation. Either way, there was no turning back. The partial truth I held had grown a larger picture, and Aunt Margaret knew altogether. Whatever happened at that meeting would push the conflict into a new, more dangerous phase. I did not agree to meet Aunt Margaret the next morning. Instead, I replied to her call with a short text saying I would not schedule another one-on-one conversation unless I could bring Maya with me as a neutral witness. The reply sat unread for hours, and I used that window to sleep fitfully, my mind cycling through every piece of evidence I had saved. When I woke Friday, there was no response, only a string of separate messages from distant relatives, each one phrased like gentle advice, but carrying the same unspoken accusation. I was being selfish to hold on to unused land when Hayden needed it. Maya arrived at my townhouse shortly after breakfast, carrying a thermos of coffee and a notepad. She sat across from me at the dining table and helped me sort every screenshot and scanned document into labeled folders, making sure nothing was stored only on my phone. If Margaret keeps pressing, you might want a real estate attorney to review the will clause about the food bank, she said, tapping the printed line with her pen. That detail could stop them from pushing for a quiet handover. They probably never read the whole document carefully. I nodded, but doubt crept in anyway. I'd spent most of my life craving approval from this side of my family, even knowing they'd planned behind my back. Even after Clara shared my private messages, part of me still wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe Aunt Margaret truly believed she was looking out for Hayden's future. Maybe the grading correction was just a coincidence, and they hadn't meant to build a celebration around something misleading. That quiet uncertainty gnawed at me through the morning, until a knock landed on my front door around 11. I peeked through the side window and found Clara standing on my porch alone, hands stuffed in the pockets of her jacket. I hesitated before unlocking the door, leaving the security chain latched for a moment. "What are you doing?" "I need to," Clara said quietly, her shoulders hunched against the crisp autumn. "Can I come?" "It won't take." I unlatched the chain and stepped back to let her inside. She glanced at Maya sitting at the table, then dropped onto the edge of my couch, her gaze fixed on the. For a minute, no one spoke. Then Clara lifted her head, and I saw exhaustion etched across her face, not defensive. "I didn't want to forward your text to the group," she began, voice tight. "Mom saw me reading it over my shoulder that night. She took my phone before I could stop her and sent it to the chat. I tried to tell her it wasn't right, but she shut me down. She's been planning this for months, Lila. Long before Hayden's math grade got good. My breath caught. Clara nodded, folding her arms like she was bracing. "She found out Grandma left you that lot right after all." She kept waiting for the right moment to ask, and the grade correction felt like the perfect excuse to get everyone together without raising. She knew the score jump wasn't from studying. All knew. The dinner was never a celebration. Maya leaned forward slightly but stayed silent, letting Clara. "Mom has always treated Hayden like the only one," Clara went on, her voice cracking a little. "I've spent my whole life trying not to rock the boat. If I argue with her, she shuts me out for weeks. I hate caught in the middle, but I can't keep lying by omission anymore. She's already talking about calling a family gathering this weekend, with every cousin and aunt and uncle invited. She plans to lay out the whole story in front of everyone and make you look unreasonable for refusing." The weight had settled over me. This was the larger wreck I'd feared. A full family assembly, designed to create public pressure, where saying no would paint me as cruel and ungrateful in front of dozens of people I'd known. Aunt Margaret was not going to negotiate privately. She intended to use the whole. Clara stood up, pulling a folded scrap of paper from her pocket and setting it on the caucus. "That's the time and address for the gathering at my parents' afternoon. I'm telling you because it isn't fair to blindside you again, but I can't stand with you openly yet. If I do, Mom will cut me off completely. I need to know what's coming." She turned toward the door, paused with her hand on the knob. "I'm sorry I didn't." Then she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Once she was gone, I stayed her. The event was scheduled for 2 o'clock Sunday, days away. Maya leaned over and picked it up, setting it beside our stack of printed evidence. "This is her baby," she said. "She thinks public embarrassment will make you cave. But you don't have it." I walked over to the kitchen window and watched Clara's car pull away down the street. A part of me felt sympathy for her trapped position, her mother's control, but I could not forget the way she'd stayed silent across the dinner table. The way she'd let the gossip spread without correction. Trust would not rebuild easily between us, even in truth. The old version of me would have panicked, searching for a compromise to avoid conflict with family. That version wanted to skip the gathering entirely, hide in my townhouse and let them behind my back. But after everything I'd learned, I could no longer run from the fight. Aunt Margaret thought she held all the power because she had a family narrative. What she did not know was that I now understood the full scope of her plan, and I had proof of the story. I picked up my phone and began drafting a letter on Sunday. Deed copies, the will clause about the community food bank, screenshots of the parent forum post, and notes from Clara's confession that the dinner had been planned for months. I still felt shaky, still worried about losing family ties, but the thought was lifting. I knew what I needed to do. The gap would be where the balance shifted, one way or another. The rest of Friday and all of Saturday blurred into careful preparation. Maya helped me track down a local real estate attorney for a brief consultation over the phone, just to confirm how Grandma's will clause would apply if anyone pushed for a property transfer. The lawyer confirmed what we suspected. Any voluntary deed transfer would trigger the provision directing a portion of proceeds to the community food bank. Aunt Margaret had likely never read that fine print, and it was a critical piece I could use to ground my position without raising my voice. I organized physical copies of every document into a neat folder, labeled each page clearly, and saved encrypted backups to 2 separate cloud drives plus a portable USB flash drive I kept tucked in my purse. I also wrote down a calm, concise statement I could use if I felt rushed or overwhelmed at Sunday's gathering, focusing on facts instead of emotion. My goal wasn't to shout or humiliate anyone. I only wanted to lay out the full truth so the extended family could understand what had really been planned. Late Saturday evening, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from Clara's old laptop messaging app in my memories, though this time the alert came from a different angle. I realized Aunt Margaret might try to erase the entire private group chat before Sunday, deleting every message to destroy their paper trail. If the chat history vanished, the only witness to the original plan would be Clara, and Clara was already terrified of her mother's retaliation. I sat down at my desk and mapped out what evidence could disappear quickly. The 4-person group chat was the most vulnerable. There was no guarantee I would ever see those messages again if Margaret told everyone to delete the thread. I had only glimpsed a small section once, with no screenshots of my own. That gap left me exposed. I called Maya to walk through the room. If they delete the chat, they can claim none of this was pre-planned. Pacing the living. They can say I misread a message, or took things out of context. Clara is the only person who can confirm the chat existed and what it contained. Maya replied. But pushing her to speak publicly right now might make her retreat entirely. We can't force her. What we can do is lock down every other piece of proof. We spent another hour double-checking cached forum pages, confirming the attorney's notes, and saving copies of all text messages Clara and I had exchanged since the night of. I also wrote a short, factual timeline of events from the moment I opened Clara's laptop, saving it as a dated document for my records. It wasn't proof on it, but it created a clear sequence if I needed to explain myself. At night, I struggled to sleep. My mind cycled through every possible scenario for a day. Some relatives might side with Margaret out of long-standing. Others might stay quiet to avoid picking sides. A few might finally see how she manipulated the situation to favor Hayden. I couldn't control how anyone acted. The only thing within my power was to show up steady, honest. Sunday morning arrived gray. I just simply grabbed my folder and purse and stopped to pick Maya up. She'd agreed to come as my support, not to argue. We parked a short distance from the Carter house and walked the road. Laughter drifted out from the backyard before we reached dozens of cars street. Every branch of the extended family invited, exactly as As we stepped onto the front walkway, I spotted Clara near them. She caught my eye and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to. Aunt Margaret stood at the grill in the backyard, passing paper plates of hamburgers. She saw me arrive, paused a second, then smiled and waved like everything was. We wandered through the gathering for nearly an hour before Aunt Margaret gathered everyone into a loose circle. Conversations quieted, and all faced her. She began by thanking one for coming, then smoothly shifted the topic to Hayden's bright future and the land. Her tone was unreasonable, carefully crafted to make me look unreasonable. Before I could speak, my phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number, forwarded by a distant cousin who'd been added to the private chat earlier that morning. The text was from Aunt Margaret to the original person group. Delete the entire chat history before Lila tried up. Left. My fingers tightened around the hand. She was already destroying the evidence, but it didn't matter as much as it would have 2 days before. I had built my case from sources. The will, the attorney confirmation, the school grading records, Clara's earlier confession, and now this last-minute message proving they intended. I took a slow breath and stepped forward into the moment had arrived. There was no more waiting, no more quiet preparation. All I could do now was speak plainly and let the family hear every part of the story they had not been told. The hum of conversation faded completely as I stepped forward. Aunt Margaret paused mid-sentence, her polite smile freezing for a heartbeat before she recovered, soft and maternal in front of the crowd. I could feel dozens of eyes fixed on me, curious, sympathetic, already judgmental, depending on which version of the story each relative had heard over the past few days. Maya stayed at my shoulder, quiet support, not stepping between me and the rest of the family. I appreciate everyone being here, I began, keeping my voice level so it would carry across the lawn without sounding angry. Before we talk about the land Grandma left me, there are a few things that haven't been shared with most of you. Aunt Margaret cut in quickly. Lila, this doesn't need to turn into something messy in front of everyone. I think it does, I said gently but firmly. The dinner celebrating Hayden's math grade was planned in a private 4-person group chat that I was never invited to. That chat's whole purpose was to coordinate asking me to sign over the Oak Street lot, using the grade correction as an excuse to gather the family. And that grade jump wasn't from extra studying. It came from a district-wide rubric error at the high school. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. A few cousins glanced at each other in surprise. Uncle Troy shifted awkwardly where he stood beside the grill, avoiding eye contact. Hayden crossed his arms and stared at the grass at his feet. Aunt Margaret's composure cracked. That is wildly out of context. We were only discussing family support. I also have a copy of Grandma's full will, I continued, opening my folder and holding up printed pages for anyone who wanted to see. If I voluntarily transfer this property, a portion of any proceeds must go to the community food bank, where Grandma volunteered for 30 years. That clause is easy to miss if you only skim the document, but it's legally binding. I paused, letting that sink in. Many in the family knew how deeply Grandma cared about that food. It made Margaret's rush for a quiet handover look far less self. Before I could keep going, Clara moved forward from the edge of the Everyone turned. She swallowed hard, hands trembling, and spoke loud enough for the whole group. True. Mom made that private chat years ago. They planned the dinner months before Hayden's grade was good, waiting for a good reason to bring everyone together and pressure. I was supposed to keep quiet about it. The murmur grew louder, sharp with surprise. Aunt Margaret whipped toward daughter, face tight with hurt and frustration. Clara, what are you doing? I'm tired of keeping secrets that are fair. Clara. I've spent years going along with plans I didn't agree with just to avoid. I can't do more. That was the turning point. Clara's confirmation gave weight to everything out. Several older aunts and uncles fronted Margaret, beginning to ask questions about why the conversation had been hidden away, instead of brought up honestly. Some younger cousins stepped back, no longer ready to. The unified pressure Margaret had built over days of quiet gossip. Her private ally had chosen to. Sensing she was losing control, Aunt Margaret tried to redirect the conversation back to Hayden's future, arguing the lot was still the best option for him. But the crowd was no longer willing to accept her framing face value. People asked why Hayden couldn't save for property, why the plan had required, why the family had been told only. After 20 more minutes of discussion, several relatives began drifting away from the circle to talk among themselves in smaller groups. The unified front Margaret had hoped to create was gone. She could still keep pushing for the land privately, but she would no longer have the rest of the extended family acting as her leverage. The battle lines were clearly drawn now, those who believed in honest family communication, and those who would keep pushing for the Maya, we don't have to see the whole party. I'd said everything I needed to. I handed out copies of the will clause to anyone who asked, closed my folder. I walked over to Clara, who stood alone near the porch, still shaking up. Thank you, quietly. She gave a smile. I'm so long. I didn't say we could go back to being close. Too much had happened quickly. But the wall of complete distrust between opened a little. I found Aunt Margaret and Uncle I. Her expression was cold, left it all. "This isn't over," she said quietly, for me to hear. I answered, changing my mind. Maya and I walked back to the car together, as voices continued to rise in the yard. The big family gathering had held as Margaret's weapon. Her internal eye had stepped forward, her planning exposed, and the full truth laid out for everyone to see. Still, her final lingered in my mind. She would not give up easily. Whatever came next would be the final confrontation. The drive home was quiet. Maya kept one hand resting lightly on my arm, letting me sit with everything that had unfolded at the Carter house. My chest felt tight, a mix of relief and lingering dread. Aunt Margaret's quiet threat hung over me. I knew she would not surrender after one failed family gathering. For 3 days, nothing happened. No calls, no texts, no visits. The silence was heavier than any argument. I kept checking my cloud backups each night, reconfirming all documents and screenshots were secure. Maya urged me to stay patient, to avoid reaching out first and giving Margaret another opening to twist my words. On Thursday afternoon, an email arrived in my inbox. It was from a local real estate agent copied by Aunt Margaret. The message laid out a formal offer to purchase the Oak Street lot for a sum far below its market value. Attached was a draft contract asking me to sign and return it within 5 business days. There was no friendly note, no attempt to negotiate fairly. It was a formal push, framed as a business transaction instead of a family request. I forwarded the entire email to the attorney we'd consulted earlier. The lawyer wrote back within hours, advising me not to respond directly, not to sign anything, and to let them handle all formal communication moving forward. That evening, the attorney sent a polite official reply declining the offer and confirming the property was not for sale. I thought that might end until Clara called me late that night. Her voice was shaking. Mom found out the attorney responded. She's furious. She's talking about filing some kind of quiet claim, saying Grandma was pressured into writing the will. I don't think she has a real case, but she's determined to drag this. My stomach sank. Contesting a will was a serious, even without solid evidence. It would mean legal fees, depositions, months of stress, and dragging Grandma's memory into messy public dispute. I thanked Clara for the warning and then called Maya to walk me through the new development. The next morning, the attorney phoned me directly. They explained that a will contest based on undue influence required substantial proof, which Aunt Margaret was unlikely. Still, the process would drain time and energy. We agreed to compile a complete evidence kit, including the timeline of the private group chat, the grade correction records, and Clara's witness statement if she was willing to. By Saturday, Aunt Margaret sent a final message asking to meet one time, alone, at the same downtown diner where we'd spoken before. The attorney advised me to decline a meeting, but after talking it over with Maya, I decided to go, with Maya present and my folder of. I wanted to hear exactly what she planned to do. We arrived at the diner at 8:00. Aunt Margaret was already seated in the back booth, a stack of printed papers spread. When Maya sat down beside me, her tightened, but she did not ask my. You don't have to bring backup to every conversation. I don't intend to have conversations that become one-sided pressure, I replied. What is it about? She slid a printed copy of the low purchase offer. This is the last reasonable we'll get. If you refuse, we move forward with contesting the will. Think about what that will do to our family name. I've already spoken to my attorney, I told her. The property not for sale. Any attempt to contest the will be met with our full evidence of how this whole plan began in your group chat, using Hayden's corrector. Aunt Marg's face flushed. That chat was family planning. You had to read it, not seek it out. The notification popped up when I was preparing to laptop. But that does not change the facts. You ambushed dinner, spread gossip about your relatives, and now you're threatening legal action over property Grandma and. We sat in tense silence for a moment. Then Uncle Troy, who had followed Margaret inside and stood near the booth, spoke up for this. Margaret has gone too far. We don't have grounds to fight the will, just hurting everyone. She to him in disbelief. You taking her side? I'm taking the side of what's right, he said quietly. Grandma made her choice. Hayden, who had waited in the car outside, stepped through the diner door a minute later, and followed his parents in. He looked uncomfortable in everyone's eyes. I never asked for any of this. I didn't even want that lot. Did it for me. The last pillar of Margaret's argument crumbled. Her son did not want the land. Her husband used to back the legal fight. Clara had a truth to the family. All that remained was her own stubborn determination she wanted. Aunt Margaret stared around the booth at each of us and bit her. She gathered slowly and stood, This isn't how I expected any of this to end. Her voice flat. But I won't drag us through court. Not if no stand with me. She walked out without another goodbye. Uncle Troy paused briefly, gave me a small nod and followed her. Hayden lingered for a second, mumbled an awkward soft behind them. Maya reached across, eased my hand. It's over. He's backing down. I leaned back against the booth, exhaling a breath I felt like I'd been holding since that afternoon at Clara's house when I saw the group chat notification. The long confrontation had reached its peak, and I had not had to sacrifice to keep the peace. Still, victory felt bittersweet. Some family bonds had fractured too to ever be fully repaired. I paid for our drinks and onto the sidewalk. The afternoon sun filtered through the storefront, warm on my face. The fight was finished, but I knew the work ahead was different. Setting steady boundaries, rebuilding relationships where possible, and accepting that not every meant to stay close forever. The weeks after that diner meeting unfolded slowly, softening the sharp tension that had hung over every family interaction for months. Aunt Margaret kept her distance. She did not call, did not send passive-aggressive messages, and never brought up the Oak Street lot again. Uncle Troy sent me a brief, handwritten note a week later, apologizing for staying silent for so long and saying he hoped someday we could speak without bitterness. I wrote back a short, neutral reply, acknowledging his note without promising quick reconciliation. Hayden went back to focusing on school and soccer. I ran into him once at the grocery store. He hesitated for a moment before giving me a quick nod and moving on. There was no real conversation between us, and I did not push for one. He had been caught in the middle of his mother's plans, and I could not hold him fully responsible for everything that had happened. Clara and I met for coffee one Saturday morning at a quiet cafe downtown. The air between us was careful, no longer the easy comfort we'd shared as kids, but free of the heavy distrust that had settled after she forwarded my private text. She told me she'd started setting firmer boundaries with her mom, turning down requests that made her uncomfortable, and refusing to participate in behind-the-scenes planning. I still feel guilty I didn't speak up sooner, she said, stirring her latte slowly. I spent so long trying to keep everyone happy that I forgot what fairness looked like. I understand being scared to push back, I told her honestly. But trust takes time to rebuild. I'm not ready for us to go back to how things used to be, not yet. I'd like us to build something new, if we both want. She nodded, accepting that truth without argument. We talked about lighter things after her work at the town office, new books I'd ordered for the bookstore, the changing autumn weather. It was a small, gentle start. I visited the Oak Street lot one crisp October afternoon. I parked on the side of the road and walked across the grass to the old oak tree Grandma had pointed out years before. The branches stretched wide overhead, leaves turning gold in the sunlight. I ran my hand along the rough bark and thought about all the choices that had led me. Opening Clara's laptop, reading that secret group, choosing not to give in to family pressure, learning to defend what belonged to me without becoming. I had not tried to ruin anyone's reputation. All I'd done was protect an inheritance Grandma had intentionally left me and ask that my family treat me with honor. That was enough. I pulled out my phone and took a quiet photo of a tree, saving it to my personal album. I still did not have concrete plans to build anything there anytime soon, but it felt good knowing the land was mine to decide the future of, on my own. Back at the bookstore, business moved at its usual pace. Maya stopped by most weeks for lunch, and we laughed about how much stress those months had brought us both. She reminded me that standing up for myself did not make me selfish, a lesson I was finally starting to. I stopped waiting for everyone in the family to approve of my choices. Their acceptance was no longer something I needed. Thanksgiving arrived. The extended family sent a group invitation to the usual dinner at Aunt Margaret's. I thought about it for 2 days before replying that I would not attend that year. I made plans with Maya instead, cooking a small meal at my townhouse and watching old movies. It was peaceful. No agendas. No quiet pressure to compromise myself for the sake. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and thought back to the day Clara's laptop sitting open on the kitchen island, the sudden pop of a group chat notification, curiosity pulling me to click before I could. That single small moment had unraveled a web of secrets and forced me to grow into someone braver than. Some relationships had changed permanently. Some wounds would fade slowly, never disappearing completely. But I had kept Ma's gift. I had learned to set boundaries. I had stopped shrinking myself to fit into a family dynamic that expected me to give up what mattered for everyone. The story was not about winning. It was about choosing to respect myself, even when the people I loved asked me not to. I looked out my kitchen window at the dark, quiet street, sipped my warm tea. Whatever came next, I would face it with clearer eyes and a firmer sense of where I stood.